On October 7, 2009, author Salman Rushdie visited St. Louis University to receive the St. Louis Literary Award, presented annually by the Library Associates of St. Louis University.
Good evening. My name is Ann Holton. I'm president of the Library Associates of St. Louis University. Welcome to the 42nd Annual St. Louis Literary Award. For 45 years, the mission of the Library Associates has been to support the libraries of St. Louis University. For the past 42 years, the Library Associates has presented the St. Louis Literary Award to distinguished authors for their body of work. For those of us who love libraries, books, and the authors who write them, it has been a pleasure. It is my great pleasure to introduce Father Lawrence Biondi, President of St. Louis University, and our honored guest, Sir Salman Rushdie.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to St. Louis University. Tonight we honor one of the great authors of our time, Sir Salman Rushdie. The St. Louis University Literary Award is a fitting tribute to a man whose brilliant and captivating chronicles have not only changed the world of literature, they have changed the world itself. Truly, Mr. Rushdie's novels and essays forever transformed the way stories are told, challenging conventional narrative styles and at the same time inventing a new vocabulary. He has used his own life experiences and unique insight to give book lovers around the globe a passport to discover new lands and new opportunities to explore new cultures. Mr. Rushdie's storytelling does not speak for him alone. His written work has given a voice to the immigrant. His 1981 novel, Midnight's Children, is now considered one of the most important modern English novels. An allegory about newly independent India's emergence into the modern world, it dramatizes the fragmented identities and disparate loyalties that many former colonies have faced. In his 10 novels and numerous essays, Rushdie tells us stories of magical characters, mythical plots, and conflicts that resemble folk tales. In this remarkable work and others, Mr. Rushdie has made us re-examine the English language itself. Born in India, now living in the United Kingdom, Mr. Rushdie broke new ground by blending the native tongues of two countries to create a tapestry of language that reflected his homeland and influenced writers who followed. Last year, Midnight's Children was voted by nearly 8,000 people around the world as the best novel written by a Commonwealth author in 40 years. It also recognized with the Booker Prize of 1981, the Booker of Bookers 1992, and the Best of the Bookers in 2008. Rushdie's other novels have also won numerous awards, including the James Tate Black Memorial Prize in 1982 and the British Book Award in 1995. His incredibly vivid portrayals of what it is like to be a post-colonial, transnational exile in our modern, globalized world have been recognized many times over. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our great honor that Mr. Rushdie joins us tonight to add the St. Louis Literary Award to his impressive roll of accomplishments. Let us now join together and give him a warm St. Louis welcome.
It's a fine parents like you. Fine parents like you.
Welcome, and thank you for being here this evening. It's a great honor for me today to introduce to you Sir Salman Rushdie, author of 10 novels, including Midnight's Children, The Satanic Verses, The Moor's Last Sigh, and more recently, The Enchantress of Florence.
Professor Joya Urazi of the English Department introduced Salman Rushdie to the library associates, as well as to students, faculty, and guests of St. Louis University. The author and award recipient spent the next hour answering a wide range of questions. The evening began with a question concerning imaginary homelands.
The idea of the imaginary homelands, it was very difficult to write about India when living in London, right. And before I wrote the book, Midnight's Children, I went back to India and I was there for a long time. I was there for maybe 6 or 7 months, really just trying to revisit the places I knew already that I knew I would want to write about, and other places like Benares, for example, where I had not been, but I suspected was going to be in the book. And it was also a very strange time to be in India because it was the time when the period of so-called emergency rule, that when Indira Gandhi suspended democracy, began. So I was also there at that time. And then I retreated home to London to try and write, and it felt very strange to be looking out at English streets while trying to bring into being this other world. So that essay arose just out of that worry, about being outside. Later on, actually, I came to think that it had been actually helpful to not be in India to write the book. Because the thing is that the book has an absurd ambition, which is to contain the whole country within the pages of a single book. Right. Now, if you're actually in India, it's obvious to you that you can't contain the history of a single street inside a book. Yes. And I think if I'd been in India, I wouldn't have had the guts to write the book. I think I had to go away in order to kid myself that it was possible to do it. And maybe also just to get that little extra bit of distance. One of the problems is that I can't remember my own books well enough, but there's I don't know, one of the books, and you'll know, in which somebody says words to the effect that the only people who see the whole picture are the ones who step out of the frame. And I think that was what I meant by that, was that sometimes it is helpful to take that little sideways step. But the truth is that the most moving thing about writing Midnight Children and the books that followed it was the fact that they were recognized in India and Pakistan as not being imaginary, if you like, the homelands. The way in which people responded to the portrayal of India and Pakistan, was, it was incredibly, gratifying is to understate it. It was moving, And I remember the first time I ever did a reading in my life, in Cambridge, in England. It was the literary magazine Granta. At that point was a very small thing, and it operated upstairs from an art gallery in Cambridge. And the editor, the American editor, Bill Buford, persuaded the art gallery to allow him to organize book readings every so often. And he had published in a very early issue, Granta number 3, contained the first chapter of Midnight's Children, basically, and that was its first publication. And so he invited me to come and do a reading, and I'd literally, nobody knew who the hell I was. I was this kid with one chapter in a magazine that nobody read. And I came along really, the book had just been published by then, And I thought, if 10 people turn up, that'd be good, And when I got there, the place was just bursting at the seams. There were crowds down the street. And it was a very large proportion of that crowd was the local Indian community, or Indian Pakistani community. And that was very touching, And I remember in this Q&A section, a woman stood up said, I want to thank you, Mr. Rushdie, because you have told my story. And I thought, well, that's not so bad, I mean, that's a good review. And so in a way, I think in the end, I came to feel that there was the closeness between the imagined world and the real world, it was close enough to be satisfying. Because I think if it had simply been some kind of fantasy of India, it would have been less satisfying. So in that sense, I think one of the problems of being called a writer of magic realism and so on is that people don't realize, I think, that the phrase magic realism, one of the words in that phrase is realism. And that one of the things you're trying to do is to be real. You're not just simply trying to escape from it. So yes, I mean, I think there's a gulf between the real and the text, but you want to make the gulf small most of the time. Or if you're going to enlarge it, you need to be doing that on purpose and not because you don't know how to do anything else. So to that extent, even right now, to now, I mean, The Enchantress of Florence is a novel set 400 years ago, partly in Mughal India, partly in Renaissance Italy, and partly in everywhere in between, because it's a journey novel. And even though the book has some elements which are fable-like and fantasticated, I was very keen to make the reader feel that the world is real. That if they had found themselves in the streets of Florence at the time of Machiavelli, that it might have been a bit like this. That if they had found themselves at the court of the Emperor Akbar, that maybe it would have felt as I say it did. So I'm actually very interested in, if you like, in narrowing that gap between the fantastic and the real. And I think those writers who have got this right are writers who have understood that fantasy or the fantastic in fiction works best when it grows out of the real. So that when you think about Charles Dickens, for example, there are elements. Dickens's prose has a very remarkable quality, which is that the background is obsessively naturalistic. Right. So the world of the Dickensian city, for example, is created in the most almost manic detail, right. And then projected upon this hyper-realist screen are characters and images which are more or less surrealist. So you have, I mean, not just that the characters are larger than life, which they are, but also that there are elements in the narrative which are bizarre to the point of surrealism, such as, the Circumlocution Office, a government department that exists in order to do nothing. Which actually that's completely realistic. The case in Bleak House, the trial, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, a court case that goes on for generation after generation is exactly like the kind of exaggeration into fantasy that you find, for instance, in Garcia Marquez, right. Of the railway train that goes by for a week. I mean, it's the same kind of principle. The dust heaps in Our Mutual Friend, this idea of mountains of garbage dwarfing a city, have a culture dwarfed by its own trash. These are completely surrealist images that could work, in a painting by De Chirico or as well as in a magic realist contemporary novel. But the reason it works is that bedrock of observation and realism is there, and they grow out of that. And so that, I mean, that's more or less what I've always tried to do.
How did you happen to write a children's novel?
What happened is, in 1989, not my favorite year for some reason, although for everybody else, a kind of fantastic year. Fall of communism, freedom of Nelson Mandela, etc. Everybody was having a good time. Me, not so much. But at that time, my then only son had just turned 10, and one of the things that that he would say to me was, why don't you write books that I can read? And at the time I was writing the Satanic verses, so I said, if you'll just let me finish this book, then I'll try and write one that you can read. And so that was the deal. So I finished it, and then, what happened, and there was a time when it was, just my relationship with him became very complicated, and it was difficult to see him and so on, or it required all kinds of curious machinations in order to see him. And I just thought, in this situation, the one thing I can't do is not keep the promise that I made. So I wrote Haroun in the Sea of Stories out of that impulse. And I have to say, even though it was a horrible time for me, it was one of the most pleasurable writing experiences that I ever had, writing that book. And certainly one of the most pleasurable publishing experiences because, letters from younger readers are much more interesting than letters from older readers. And so I had a lot of fun with it, and I always thought, well, maybe I should do this again. But there had been a very specific motivation to writing that book, which was to write for an audience of one. And I thought afterwards that many of the children's books that I most admired and thought of as models had also been written for particular children. That Alice in Wonderland is written for Alice Liddell. Winnie the Pooh was written for Christopher Robin Milne. Peter Pan was written for the Llewellyn Davis boys. And as you go through it, you see that many of these, the greatest classics, were written in that way to please a particular child, and not just general. Because Alice, for instance, see, if you look at Alice in Wonderland, she's she's not a generic girl. She's a very individual girl. For a start, she's incredibly bossy. There she is. She's in Wonderland, for goodness sake. She doesn't even know the rules of the game. She doesn't know what size she is. But she still tells everybody off all the time. Wherever she goes, she's scolding people. And I thought that has to be a girl that he knew. That's not a generic girl. That's a girl that the author was personally acquainted with. And the same reason I tried to make Haroun, the character Haroun in the book, particular in the same way, and a kind of close representation of my son at that age. But I also thought of it as a book to be read at two ages, that I would want him to read it again as an adult and get a different sort of satisfaction from it. So I was very consciously writing a book aimed at two ages at the same time, and then, there was no further reason to do it because he grew up and, was reading, other books not written by me. In fact, I think it's the only book of mine he ever finished. But then now I've got myself another boy of that age, and he's been saying for the last couple of years, so where's my book? And I think there's only two answers to that. One answer is to say, kid, life is not fair. Deal with it. And the other is to write the book. So I've written the second one. It's called Luca and the Fire of Life, and it's coming out next year at some point. I don't know exactly when it's coming out.